Welcome to the History of Psychology show. I'm your host, Christopher Green from York University in Toronto, Canada. The aim of the show is to converse with prominent working historians of psychology, not only about their research, but also about their backstories, their careers, and their views of the field more generally. For episode 5, I am pleased to have with me my colleague at York, Thomas Teo. Thomas and I were hired within a year or two of each other back in the mid-1990s, and we have spent our whole careers more or less circling around each other. Thomas, like many scholars of European origin, aims to bring his historical studies to bear on modern theoretical questions. His primary interest is in the ideological engines behind race and racism and other kinds of social injustice that beset our world today. His analyses, often couched in unusual terms that have been newly fashioned for their particular purpose, illuminate the darker aspects of our assumptions about how society should function. Assumptions that have lurked, sometimes for decades, in the shadowy corners of our collective mind. In some listeners, there will be a tendency to dismiss the strange language he sometimes uses as mere academic jargon. But if you listen more closely, you may find that it is our common language that has been constructed so as to shield us from the unpleasant implications of what we actually mean. Paradoxically, it can sometimes take an unfamiliar vocabulary to allow us to speak plainly. Thomas has authored or co-authored 4 books and edited or co-edited 6 more, one with me. He has written dozens of chapters and articles. He has published in a wide range of historical and theoretical journals. To the community of workaday psychologists, his most visible article is probably his 2015 piece on critical psychology in the APA's flagship journal, American Psychologist. Thomas is a fellow of 5 different APA divisions, as well as the Canadian Psychological Association. In 2019, he was granted the Theodor Sarbin Award by APA's Division 24 for notable achievement in innovative critical work in theoretical psychology. For the first half of the 2010s, Thomas was the editor of the Journal of Theoretical and Philosophical Psychology, the in-house journal of Division 24 of APA. And he is now co-editor with Wade Pickren of the Review of General Psychology, the in-house journal of APA Division 1. I am glad to be able to share him with you. This promises to be a highly enlightening conversation. So, Thomas Teo, welcome to the History of Psychology show.
Thanks for inviting me to this interview.
I'm glad to have you here. I'd like to start with talking about the subject or subjectivity, which you take to be the primary focus of psychology. The study of subpersonal mental functions such as perception and memory and personality traits are a kind of evasion of psychology's primary mission. So could you talk a bit about what you mean by subjectivity? As you note, it is not a term that is used much in mainstream psychology these days.
So by subjectivity, I mean the totality of the first-person mental life when living life. This is not a particularly elegant definition because we have life here 3 times. You could say the totality of the first-person mental life in the conduct of life. Then you could also make the argument totality is not very elegant either. Nobody talks about totality anymore. What I mean by totality is the wholeness, the more or less integrated wholeness of mental life when we actually live our daily lives, our everyday lives. And this is also slightly different, this definition, from what has been proposed, let's say, in philosophy as first-person perspective. Perspective has too much of a cognitive connotation for me, or perceptual connotation. So I don't like the term perspective either. I don't like also the term first-person standpoint. Because I'm also interested in things that are unaware or unconscious, if you like. And of course, critical disability studies people have criticized standpoint and suggested you have to talk about the first-person sit point because it would be, not taking into account that certain people can't actually stand. So that's why I talk about the totality of the first-person mental life in everyday life, if you like. And you could ask exactly this question: what happened to subjectivity? What happened to what I call the subdivision of subjectivity? I think the subdivision of subjectivity has three sources. One source is, of course, intellectual, and here we're going already sort of say a little bit into historical reflection, but you have an intellectual subdivision of subjectivity. Let's think about Plato. So then you have you divide sort of say subjectivity, mental life, the psyche, the psychological into three parts. Then you can ask questions, which part is more important, which parts are less important. But in any case, once you start to subdivide the mental life, you have an intellectual subdivision. I think that is one source. Another source is, of course, what we call the institutional subdivision. So you could make the argument with the development of Western society, with the emergence of modernity, with the development of institutions, what you have is basically different interests regarding a person's subjectivity depending on the institution. So let me give you an example. What I mean by that, in the military, what kind of psychological attributes of interest? Let's say if you want to become a sharpshooter, sensory acuity obviously is of interest. Leadership, if you become an officer. In the educational system, we know what is of interest if a child can keep up with what is taught in a classroom, or do they need special education? Cognitive abilities is of interest in the educational system. In the work sphere, are you punctual? What is your competence? Leadership role to a certain degree, depending what position you take. Are you conscientious? That is of interest in the work sphere. In the legal sphere, forensic sphere, the reliability of eyewitness testimonies. Are you going to reoffend, let's say, if you're convicted? That is of interest. So what I'm trying to say is, so you have also a subdivision of subjectivity in different modern institutions. And so I think that is the second source. And the third source is, of course, that brings us to the 19th century, that what model of science do we endorse? And I think in the 19th century, you had a slight conflict between a research model and what people would label a philosophical model, what you more precisely could call a system model of science if we think about Hegel. So the research model, of course, was the model that was adopted in natural sciences. You look at smaller and smaller parts of an object, and you look how this small part relates to another small part, let's say in the same object or from another object. And so this is the reason, and that was an extremely successful model in science, of course. And then you have the system model of science, which is, of course, for us completely outrageous. The idea that you can capture totality, the totality of reality in a system, in a comprehensive system of concepts. I mean, that was basically Hegel's goal. And that basically disappeared. And what you have in psychology, that psychology followed the natural scientific research model, not a system model of science. And so you have the further subdivision of mental life. And it's not only, emotion, cognition, motivation, it's cognition, it's attention, it's perception. And then in cognition, it's memory, it's long-term memory, short-term memory, episodic memory, and so forth, further subdivisions, specializations. And then you look at how one small part relates to another part. And in this case, of course, you lose the totality of subjectivity. And my question is, or subjectivity gets lost. My question is, can we bring subjectivity back? Can we have a more comprehensive understanding of subjectivity? And what would be the conditions for the possibility, okay, a Kantian formulation, to develop a theory of subjectivity? And I also understand, of course, that subjectivity was maintained in psychoanalysis and in phenomenology, and you could even make the argument that for exactly those reasons that psychoanalysis maintained subjectivity as its subject matter, that it still has a large draw, because it is, so to say, within psychology, the only program left that basically is interested in subjectivity and not just particular parts of a person's subjectivity.
Right. So let me ask you a couple more questions about that. It seems to me that there's this analytic view of science. You are attempting to oppose, but there have been exceptions within science to that analytic view. I think of things like Gestalt psychology and Bertalanffy's general systems theory. Do you have any, what do you think of those?
Yes, I mean, I have no problem with those approaches, but Gestalt psychology not necessarily is interested in human subjectivity. So they have a more, systemic, if you like, understanding of perception in mind, but that not necessarily translates back to the concept of subjectivity. and I'm not saying there's not approaches that try to integrate psychological topics. I mean, that is still occurring in the review of general psychology. We get sometimes papers that try to integrate, so to say, one area, the area of wisdom, and how can we make sense of all the research that exists in the area of wisdom. All of that I'm supporting. I have no problem with that, but it doesn't elucidate, so to say, for me, a theory of subjectivity.
Right. So would you take words like synthetic or holistic to characterize your view as opposed to the traditional scientific position?
Well, it has to a certain, I mean, I used the term in the past synthetic, but that has a strange connotation. It's also not an elegant term. Holistic has also not particularly a popular connotation, I guess. But as I said, I try to understand the totality of mental life.
Right.
And that is to a certain degree holistic and to a certain degree, encompassing a broad area. And so, I try to evade a little bit the solution, so to say, to subjectivity by suggesting, what are the conditions for the possibility of a theory of subjectivity. And so, for example, while I'm impressed, or how shall I say that, I like the idea that psychoanalysis and phenomenology have put forward, but where I start, to give you a concrete example, where I start is that we have to understand what I call intrasubjectivity, intersubjectivity, and sociosubjectivity in its nexus. So intrasubjectivity would be internal psychological dynamics that exist in a person, and some stuff that is discussed in psychoanalysis. Intersubjectivity is exactly the relational dimension that people have when constructing subjectivity, and this goes back again into the 19th century, well understood in philosophy, to which degree subjectivity is a process that is dependent on relation. So I would take this into account. I think phenomenology has focused also more recently exactly on this dimension of intersubjectivity, but I'm also interested in sociosubjectivity, exactly the question, and I distinguish sociosubjectivity from intersubjectivity, the question to which degree history, culture, society constitute actually subjectivity.
So is this like social roles? Is that what sociosubjectivity is, sort of the roles that are made available to you by the society that you live in your time?
Well,
is that?
That's exactly the theoretically difficult part. How do we actually conceptualize this relationship? Yeah. And I use sometimes the idea by Klaus Holzkamp, where we all agree, and I think this shows certain limitations, maybe of cultural historical psychology, or maybe even traditional Marxist psychology, that the idea that society, culture, history determines individual consciousness. And I think his solution was to suggest that those conditions do not determine individual subjectivity, but are the premises for individual subjectivity. So we can react, so we encounter certain premises. They don't determine who I am, but I encounter those cultural, historical, social realities as premises against which or with which I can act, or which I can take a stance, or which I can habituate myself into, or which I can oppose, for example. And so it's not a relationship of determinism, it's a relationship that considers external conditions as premises. I myself have also used the concept of suture, not completely happy with that either. But in order to underscore the agentic, active dimension of humans, that we suture ourselves into society, history, culture. So it's an active process. It's not, again, somebody forces you into a certain function or role or content, but you actively suture yourself into those conditions that become part then of your identity. So it's not only, what Foucault has called subjectification, but it's actually an active process where you engage with the external world and suture yourself into those things. So it is indeed, so to say, very difficult. And in psychology, we have all these concepts of learning and adaptation and so forth. And so I think one task is exactly to conceptualize that in a way that doesn't neglect society, history, culture. At the same time, does not overestimate them as external determinants. And so, for theory of subjectivity, I say we always have to think about this nexus. So whatever we're doing, think about, sort of say, what's going on in an individual, what's going on in terms of relations, what this has to do with relations, and what this has to do exactly with society, culture, history at the same time. And I stand for certain psychological processes. This might be the internal dimension might be larger than the external, and for other processes, it might be that the external is larger than the internal aspect. So that would be one element, I think, in the theory of subjectivity. Another element, of course, is we cannot neglect physis. Physis, I use the Greek term, which I mean nature, biology, chemistry. So we cannot deny that, if you take drugs, that it has an influence on first-person mental life. And another element would be temporality. That subjectivity, of course, looks differently if you look developmentally in a child, or when you were a child, and then when you're an adult, and so forth. So, but also historical development, evolutionary development, and maybe even the day-to-day developments, or and so forth. So that would be another element. The question is about technology. To which degree is technology not only influencing subjectivity, but at what point has technology become something that constitutes actually subjectivity? And so this would be certain elements in a theory of subjectivity I'm interested in. And then I've articulated examples of subjectivity when I talked about, what is neoliberal subjectivity, what is fascist subjectivity, what is academic subjectivity, what's happened to academic subjectivity, and how can we conceive of academic subjectivity. And so I use the example, not role, but I use the idea that there are certain forms of subjectivity, and we suture ourselves into existing forms that historically have existed. So
do we have multiple forms of subjectivity? I have my subjectivity as a husband, or as a professor, or as, I don't know, a political activist. Are those different, I don't know, are they different aspects of a single subjectivity, or do I have multiple subjectivities within myself?
I mean, I think what you addressed, I would say there's multiple identities. I would not have a problem with multiple identities.
Okay.
The subjectivity would be sort of still a first-person subject, and they might be different in this context and in another context. So a first-person subject, I mean, this is what I say by everyday life. So we have to not detach everyday life from a theory of subjectivity. So when we work, we have sort of say we engage differently with our subjectivity than in relations, than when we create something sort of say by ourselves, as one example, or in a process of resistance. So I think that we have to articulate sort of say exactly that first person mental life in the way we conduct our lives as as working people, or as playing people, as relating people who have relationships and interactions and love, if you like, and when we relate to ourselves, or when we are creative, as one example. I think that we can understand that subjectivity given the specific context. But I agree with you that, I mean, this is an interesting question, because I've also suggested that I believe that subjectivity has been actually reduced. And so I use Eduard Spranger's, which is ironic because we would assume there should be more subjectivities with the proliferation of jobs, of opportunities, of activities that exist in this society. But I compared Spranger, who is a German, Eduard Spranger is a German philosopher, psychologist, and he wrote a book on what is called Types of Men in English, but I think it's more accurately translated as forms of life, actually. And so he describes 6, 7, you can add, of course, to those forms of life. You have an aesthetic form of life, you have a religious form of life, a social form of life, political form of life, economic form of life. And then he describes these different types of life that exist and what kind of values those people, those personalities endorse. And I've argued in my article on neoliberal subjectivity that what we have is a reduction, it seems, more and more to a single form of life, which is indeed the neoliberal form of life, meaning that whatever you do, you have to think like an entrepreneur or a business person. So this idea, the academic, where their own places in Spranger's theory, suddenly has to think like an entrepreneur. The artist has to think like an entrepreneur. The church leader has to think like an entrepreneur.
How you market
this
yourself,
is what I mean.
How you sell yourself, those kinds of things.
Yes, that you have to think about exactly cost-benefit analysis, marketing, outcomes, commodities, and the idea that in neoliberalism, we all basically have to endorse now a neoliberal subjectivity if we want to conduct our lives in a successful way, if you like to use this term, as sort of the reduction actually of subjectivity. So this seeming contradiction that we have this increase of opportunities and at the same time the decrease actually of forms of subjectivity into the entrepreneur. It's very difficult, as you know, to survive, let's say, as an academic outside of academia. So this idea of an independent scholar is not a viable form. And even within academia, we endorse more and more metrics of excellence and so forth in order to understand ourselves. And we can discuss what kind of consequences they have.
Right. So in the past, let me try and make this a little concrete. So in the past, the academic article might be considered sort of a form and an intellectual expression of their intellect. But now it has become sort of a product which must be marketed to a particular audience and is going to be measured not in terms of intellectual debate, but in terms of things like how many people download it and how many people cite it and those kinds of things. Is that the idea? Yeah,
that's just one element, I think, of the neoliberalization of academic subjectivity. That, and I mean, if you reach a certain age, you know what kind of academic subjectivity you had, let's say, 20 years ago or 30 years ago, and what kind of academic subjectivity you have nowadays. And then suddenly you start out to look yourself, sort of say, what is the citation of this article? And it's asked for, let's say, in grant applications. You might have to mention this article was cited so and so many 100 times, 1,000 times, or whatever. And that is sort of say a currency that you can use to show your own impact and your own relevance. And that is what I mean. We didn't do that 30 years ago. If that, and a younger generation who just knows that, of course, they suture themselves into this subjectivity. That is my point. They actively adopt this idea and aim for that type of metric in order to understand their own academic, I guess, quality.
Right. So in as much as conventional psychologists talk about subjectivity at all these days, I would think that they would often associate it with consciousness, which is a word you haven't used yet. What do you see as the relationship between subjectivity and what we used to call consciousness?
Well, for me, subjectivity is broader than consciousness because for me, there's a large dimension that is, not a large, but there's wouldn't quantify it, but there's the dimension of subjectivity that is unconscious or unaware. I prefer the term unaware. So think about privilege as an example. So privilege can be part of our subjectivity, but it's not part of our consciousness. So if I, let's say, as a white person, have a higher probability of getting a job through my CV because of my British sounding name, as opposed to a black person with a not English sounding name, then you have a certain privilege. And that might be part of your subjectivity. You're not aware of it. That constitutes a first person mental life, but it's never part of your consciousness. So I think that would be one.
It informs your experience, though, right? You believe that you have a certain quality and your relationship to the job market is a certain kind, but that is affected by this privilege that you have that you're not directly aware of.
Exactly. That's exactly my point. And so that would not be captured consciousness. And the second one, I think subjectivity, and I just hinted at that, I think has to include the body as well. The first person experience of one's body is part of one's subjectivity. If just to use sort of a more obvious example, if one has a disability, well, this clearly, so to say, affects one's first person mental life. And not saying so, and exactly my point is, it's not just intrapsychological, but it's also social, historical, and cultural. And that is, I think, what critical disability studies has emphasized, that we have to look at disability not only as an individual problem, but also as a social problem. So when I use the example of disability, I don't think it's just an internal problem that is articulated in one subjectivity, but exactly that nexus between intersubjectivity, and socio-subjectivity. But the body would be one example, I think, of part of subjectivity, but not consciousness, or even the body in pain. Let's say you have chronic pain, that could be part of one's own subjectivity. Maybe it's part of consciousness. One could twist it, I guess, in this direction. But I think my idea about subjectivity is much broader than consciousness.
Okay. So you also advance a project that you call the psychological humanities, which you sort of explicitly contrast with the more common phrase psychological science. And the idea here is to re-include multiple routes to knowledge back into research on mind and behavior, things like history and philosophy and social and political and cultural theory and even the arts. So it would seem to me that there's some fundamentally epistemological principle that underlies this. I'm sure there are lots of natural scientific researchers who would argue that these other disciplines do not lead as reliably to knowledge as empirical science does. And while one might argue that history is empirical in a sort of an unsystematic sense, philosophy tends to rely more on argumentation and speculation, and the arts, I think some would argue, isn't really an epistemological project at all, a knowledge gathering project at all. So what's your epistemological position that grounds this idea of there being a psychological humanities?
I think there's two answers to this question. One answer would be what I call the psychological paradox. And I think it is indeed, so to say, where ontology and epistemology are actually intertwined. By the psychological paradox, I mean the fact that psychological topics have a natural scientific dimension, but also a cultural dimension. So let's think about memory. So memory, yes, surely I can study memory from a natural scientific perspective. There's no doubt about it. But memory has also a first-person quality. So memory is also always my memory. And that content of my memory, so that's what constitutes my memory, what do I give meaning in my memory, what do I emphasize in my memory, that is also a first-person, has a first-person dimension. And so I think that this is what I mean by the psychological paradox, then, that you can study a topic such as memory indeed from a natural scientific perspective, and you can study it from a human scientific perspective. You think about biographies. The second approach is, and maybe that articulates it a little bit more clearly, is that I don't give primacy then to epistemology. I actually give primacy to a certain degree to ontology. And that's a slightly tricky argument, because I know one can say, well, in order to make an ontological argument, you have to have already epistemologies on that ontology. But
can I clarify for our audience just a minute what those words mean? So epistemology is the study of knowledge, how we acquire knowledge. Ontology is the study of being, what some things underlying essences. Is that how you see those words working?
Yes, let's even sort of make it clearer than that. So I like to start with the object, the topic, or let's call it object. An object can be a topic, a process, and so forth. And then I look what helps me understand that object. And what helps me understand that object could be natural scientific methodology, or could be human scientific methodology. And so if you start with the topic of subjectivity, yes, I'm not discounting, so to say, certain natural scientific approaches are very useful. But I would also argue that indeed what we have called the psychological humanities are very useful, indeed, so to say, for understanding human subjectivity. So if that is, or to repeat, so to say, the point I'm trying to make is, how are we doing justice to the object? That is my question. And are we doing justice to this object only through natural scientific methodology, or at what point is a natural scientific methodology doing injustice to the object? And to which degree is a human scientific methodology doing justice to the object we're interested in? And to which degree is it doing injustice to the object? So I think this is basically where I start. And if that's my starting point, then I can ask, so what can I learn from philosophy? What can I learn from history? What can I learn from the arts about human subjectivity? And let's use the example of arts. So I'm not sure if you know Anselm Kiefer. Anselm Kiefer is a pretty famous German artist. Mm-hmm. And and you can ask the question, what can I learn about, let's say, German subjectivity from a German artist such as Anselm Kiefer, who grew up after the war and had to cover, so to say, in his art a lot of what's going on in post-war Germany. And he articulates a lot of those sentiments in his own art. So he became famous by showing himself with a Hitler Gruß, which of course offended a lot of people. It's not, so to say, a celebration of German fascism. It was basically articulation. How can you make art as an artist after Nazi Germany? What kind of identity can you have as a German if you have that history? So I can learn something, let's say, by reading interviews, looking at his arts, and experts, by looking at the art of Anselm Kiefer, something about German, let's say, subjectivity. I can learn something from Weiwei about resisting subjectivity. How can you resist, so to say, a political system that oppresses you? And Weiwei would be an example to understand, so to say, using art as a form of resistance against an oppressive political system. So I learned something about resisting subjectivity. And when I talk about subjectivity, I didn't mention this before, I'm not only interested what actually happens in the human mind, but also what is possible in the human mind. And that, of course, goes back to the 17th century Christian Wolff, who wrote, a volume on empirical psychology and another volume on rational psychology. Mm. And he says, indeed, so to say, what happens in the human mind, and also what is possible in the human mind. And so I'm not picking up on his rational psychology, but just the idea that in a theory of subjectivity, yes, we should actually capture what happens in human mind, but also actually what is possible.
So does literature capture what is possible rather than what is actual? Is that how literature fits into the psychological humanities?
Yes, I mean, that's what I'm trying to say. Arts would be an example of resisting art, how we can use art as a form of resisting subjectivity. Mm-hmm. So most of us don't make window cranks out of glass, which is an example of his art. So he made a window crank out of glass because during the party meetings, they removed the taxi window crank so people couldn't throw out leaflets. And so he makes a window crank out of glass to indicate, so to say, exactly that, to point people to the history of that technology by power, and to subvert sort of that technology of power. So Weiwei would be an example of a resisting subjectivity.
So would you regard things like Proust's Remembrance of Times Past or Robert Musil's The Man Without Qualities to be a kind of elements of the psychological humanities, or is that entirely separate?
No, that would be, if you can articulate, I mean, if a person or a psychologist can articulate for me to which degree this helps us actually understand human mental life, then I indeed would say that's part of this psychological humanities. So we can learn something from the arts, from novels about human mental life. I mean, what is odd, I guess, is that lots of people nowadays, with the increase of social media and of streaming television shows and streaming movies, like probably actually sorry,
like this very one that we're doing.
Yeah,
right
would might actually learn a lot about human subjectivity, human mental life, actually from those things. They might not, and once you articulate it, what you actually learned, and if you write it down, then of course we can debate it if this is a meaningful addition to the field of psychology. But I think that human beings actually might learn a lot, wrongly, falsely, about human mental life from those visual media. So in that sense, the arts, I think, are actually very significant in our understanding of human mental life. And it would be one element in the psychological humanities. Now, psychological humanities, of course, would have a larger, it would have to be an articulation of what is going on. So Proust himself would not be, sort of, say, psychological humanities, but somebody writing about Proust and articulating what this does, that would be sort of psychological humanities for me. So it will not just be a piece of art is psychological humanities, but somebody who articulates what was going on in this art with regard, let's say, to an artist or with regard to a culture. That will be part of the psychological humanities.
All right. So I'd like to move on to, I don't know, a somewhat more disturbing phrase that you use in your research, epistemic violence. The idea here is that the very act of making knowledge can be harmful to people, especially to groups of people. For instance, people who have been deemed to have a mental illness or who do not conform to the sexual or gender conventions of their society, or people who are grouped together under a racial label like Black. Eugenics, I suppose, would be the classic example here, but almost any research on inherent racial differences or sex differences could be used in that way. Could you talk a little bit about what you mean by epistemic violence and where it applies?
Yes, I mean, epistemic violence was originally coined by Spivak, the post-colonial researcher, philosopher, theoretician, and she used this term loosely, I think, when it comes to the construction of the colonized other in academic, cultural, artistic, institutional discourses. So it was a very broad understanding, texts that are written about India, discourses about Indians, constitute a form of epistemic violence because they are othering the Indian, they don't hear the voices of the Indians, and they keep them silent. So this is sort of a pretty much broad, unspecific definition. And so one could make the argument, indeed, that everything that was written in eugenics and on race psychology, race science, or everything is basically epistemic violence. I'm not necessarily disagreeing with that, but I wanted actually to develop an argument that can convince also traditional psychologists and even traditional methodologists. And I was asking the question, what does what I call epistemological violence mean in empirical research in the social sciences, in empirical research in psychology? And in order to do that, I had the choice to choose, so to say, a certain part of the research process. And so if we divide the research process into context of discovery, which means basically what questions are asked and why, context of justification, let's make it simple, questions about methodology, I add the context of interpretation and the context of application. How do I interpret data and what do I do with knowledge? So I have 4 areas. again, might not be the most elegant, given sort of the historical connotations of these terms, which come, of course, from positivism. But that's how I sort of try to understand the research process. And so I could indeed put epistemic violence into the context of discovery, but I didn't do that. I could put in the context of discovery saying, well, this question that you ask is epistemologically violent. You ask whether group X is more greedy than group Y. You ask whether group A is more lazy than group B. That is a violent question, and you shouldn't ask this question. If you argue that, of course, the immediate reaction is you just want to censor people. You want to stifle freedom of speech. You're illiberal when it comes to research and so forth. So I did not want to put it in the context of discovery. I wanted to put it in the context of interpretation, because I think traditional methodologists are well aware this is a standard problem within the traditional philosophy of science and within methodology, that the interpretation of data is not determined by the data themselves. So data do not lead to one single interpretation, even if interpretations are underdetermined by data. And I think that is exactly where I located an epistemological violence in empirical research. If I find differences, let's say, between two groups, and I interpret one group as being inferior, to give you one example, although the same data allows me for a variety of different interpretations that are equally plausible based on the data presented, then I commit a form of epistemological violence. So this was my very technical definition, that an interpretation that does harm to a group, although equally viable alternative interpretations are available, and you label this you label your interpretation as knowledge or as fact, then you have a form of epistemological violence. So, for example, if when it comes to women, so you notice there's fewer female faculty at elite institutions in the United States than male faculty, and your conclusion is women are less intelligent than men. This interpretation of the data from the fact that there's indeed, so let's assume that's a fact, that's the data what shows that there's fewer female academics at elite universities in the United States than male academics. The interpretation that it shows that women are less intelligent would, for me, be a form of epistemological violence, because you have equally viable alternative interpretations and you present your knowledge as fact and as knowledge.
So the alternative interpretation would be that women are oppressed, that they are prevented in some way from attaining those posts, even though they have the inherent ability to do so. Is that would be? Yes, there's
a set of other interpretations that are possible, and the question is sort of say, do the alternative interpretations also produce harm? And then you have to discuss sort of say, what kind of harm, or do they not produce harm? And so what you find indeed in race psychology, scientific racism, is the reality that people do quantitative studies, they find differences, and then they interpret the differences not in favor of the disadvantaged group, but usually in favor of the advantaged group. And in doing so, they can produce harm. We can discuss them what harm qualifies as harm, and is then a form of epistemological violence for me.
So within your discussion of epistemological violence, you use some interesting terms, subhumanism and dieability. These are disturbing. What do they mean, and where do you find them?
Well, I think they're not completely related to that, but they have a certain relation given that they're from the same subjectivity. But I've become more interested, of course, for historical reasons, in fascist subjectivity, the continuity of fascist subjectivity, the treatment of migrants in Europe, the treatments of migrants in the United States, and made the argument actually that basically the underlying affective, cognitive, visual idea that engenders sort of some of this practice may be the concept or the theory or the idea of the subhuman. The subhuman is basically a terminology that comes out of race theory, but also Nazi terminology. You have sources in the United States, you have sources in Nazi Germany. The idea that a certain group of human beings don't qualify as humans, and if they don't qualify as human beings, then you basically don't deserve the same rights, you don't deserve the same treatment, and so forth. And so some things that we have observed in Europe, let's say the treatment of migrants and the treatment of migrants at the Mexican-American border cannot otherwise be explained than they are considered as subhumans, as not only, you know, a lower class of humans, but something that is below actually the status of human beings. And subhumanism works very much not with cognition, but very much with visualizations. And you could make the argument that race theory, racism, scientific racism works a lot with theories and science and statistical analysis and data and seemingly irrational arguments. You know, if you go back into some of these books, they're full with tables, full with data, full with statistical analysis. So they try to appeal, so to say, to the cognitive parts, I guess, of human beings, whereas subhumanism just needs visualization. You just look at them. It's clear that they are subhuman. A normal being wouldn't look like this. A normal being wouldn't act like this. A normal being would not run over the border, would not wear those type of clothes, and so forth. Below the standard of civilization, as it was called, and therefore they don't afford the same human rights. And
so you take images of people at their most desperate and put them forward as though they are typical of that group of people, and therefore they are not like us in some sense. Is that the dynamic? Is that the mechanism?
Yes, I think it's an us versus them dynamic, but more it's not only us versus them, it's they are below the standard of humanity. Right. So, you know, us versus them could be, you know, we like the Maple Leafs and some other team like somebody else, and so it's us versus them, but we would not consider them to be subhuman, where we can treat them sort of as a class of people right. that are below the standards of humanity. And I think right. that comes into place as well. They are below the standards of humanity, yeah. and because they're below the, we can do whatever we want to, and this can reach from you know, separating children from parents to extermination, as was done in Nazi Germany, of course. So Jews are below the standard of human beings. They are parasites, rats, all kinds of descriptions of animals that were used, and therefore they have to be exterminated. And it's not only possible to exterminate them, but it's actually required to exterminate them. And I think that is what makes the ontology of subhumanism interesting. Also, that this ontology has resurfaced, it seems, reemerged in modern liberal democracies. That was fascinating to me. So, can you connect that to diability then? Yes, I think the question is, you know, who can we accept to die in a specific society? And I actually have to revise a little bit my original statement or argument, because in my article on migration and subhumanism, I made the argument that people in Europe would not accept the preventable death of their own population. It happens when you have, sort of say, an outsider group which are constructed as subhuman, which are migrants. There you can accept that people die on boats and we don't help them. Where we can accept that people die, let's say, in certain houses that are put on fire, that are put on place by neo-Nazis and so forth. But of course, with the COVID, we realize that lots of people are diable. So it's not only migrants that are diable, but there's actually within society, certain people are diable. And this is exactly what I'm interested in, which is different from disposable. You're disposable. Like, let's say slaves were disposable. So once you have used the labor force of these people, they're disposable. You can buy a new slave, and then you have a new labor doing the work that need to be done. And there's certain disposability there. So you can exchange one for the next. Diability means that you actually don't have any function anymore, and therefore you're diable. And so this applies, I think, particularly to people in long-term care homes, long-term care homes in Ontario, people that are diable, people in prison that are diable, people, of course, certain migrants are still diable, underclasses are diable. So we have a much larger, I think, group of diables in Western democracies as well. So they might not necessarily be subhuman. So this slightly becomes a little bit more complicated. I don't think people think that elderly people are subhuman, but they're actually diable to a certain degree. We can accept that for the running of our economy, for the accumulation of profit in this economy, we can accept that certain people can die actually. And that's perfectly fine. This is what I mean by diability.
So diable is a kind of odd, kind of awkward term. I think a more familiar term would be killable. But the distinction here is that these are not people who you're going to actively kill, but you're going to allow them to die under circumstances where maybe they didn't have to die, where their lives could be extended. Is that the distinction?
Yes, exactly. Because killable means we can kill people. The enemies are killable, enemies of the state are killable, and so forth. But that means just, we just let nature run its course, as some politician in the United States argued when it came to people dying in long-term care homes, because we have to maintain our economy. And so if we want to maintain our economy, we accept that certain people are going to die. And it happens to be, in this case, elderly people who are diable. Right. So I think that
we're relieved of our obligation of expending effort to keep them alive. Is that how it?
Yes. Yeah. I think I did not write a paper on diability. Maybe it's worth to write a paper on diability to elucidate all the different meanings and differentiations of this concept. I just mentioned couple of sentences. I think this idea of diability, that people are diable, which I think is indeed different from killable. Yeah. Let nature run its course, they're going to die because of the virus, which is also from disposable. Maybe it's worthwhile actually to do a paper on that.
That's it. Well, obviously it was a term that struck me. I thought it was worth discussing for a little while. So let me talk about your background a bit. Where were you born and raised?
Well, I was actually born in London, England. And for that reason, I have actually a British passport. And but my parents divorced when I was 3. So at that age, I moved back to Austria. So my mother is an Austrian who went, I guess, in the context of reconciliation that still existed after the Second World War, from Austria as an au pair to England, got married there. I was born there, my sister was born there. And then after the divorce, we moved back to Austria, and I grew up basically in Austria from age 3 to adulthood.
Right. So were your parents academically, or was your mother academically inclined at all?
My father had a university degree, but he did basically stuff that is not very interesting to me, which is basically finance and business. My father died a long time ago, so I didn't have much contact with him, in fact. Mm-hmm. My mother was basically a secretary. So her job was that of a secretary, but she didn't have college education.
So did you expect to go to university from a young age, or was that a difficult process, or how did you end up in doing a university degree?
Well, Austria is an interesting country because Austria in the 70s turned socialist, social democratic, we would say nowadays. But of course, there was the Socialist Party of Austria. And the Socialist Party of Austria, which, by the way, changed its name, I think, in 1991 or something, into Social Democratic Party, had lots of power, and most chancellors came in the 70s, 80s, up to the 90s, even came from the Socialist Party of Austria. And so they had indeed, so to say, these policies, which means basically education for all, the possibility of education for all. So when I went to grammar school, I didn't have to pay for books. It was all provided by the state. Not only could we keep the books, they were basically our books, and we didn't have to pay for them. The transport to the school, which was not a long distance, that was free. University is of course free. Not only was it free, but I got actually grant support a lot from the Austrian government for studying. So yeah, that dimension that played into into, I guess, choosing also university. But I think I grew up with my grandparents, and my grandparents, who had socialist leanings, always emphasized education. So I think that was part of that identity as well, that education is important. They maybe didn't know exactly what education is, but one of their own children, the firstborn, she went actually to university herself. And they didn't have money actually at the time for the second and third one, but they thought that education and university is important. And so that was part of the values, I guess, that was an important value. And so I had sort of a family, so this brings us back to subjectivity, relational. So you had a family that emphasized education. I had a social, cultural, historical context where education was achievable, even if you don't have a lot of money. You could study without tuition. You got grants, and there were maybe certain interpsychological dimensions. Well, maybe I was interested, maybe I had certain aptitudes, I don't know, that also made that possible. They did not abandon actually in Austria the two-tier system. So at age 10, you go either to a grammar school or you go to the, it was called main school, but it was sort of the main.
Sort of a technical school, grade school?
It was a standard school. It was where most people go to a standard school, right, and then a few people go to the grammar school. So at age 10, based on your grades and based on assessment by teachers, and I think it was maybe only 10% at the time went to grammar school. Now it has changed completely, but at the time when I went to grammar school, maybe 10% of an age group went to grammar school and the rest went to the standard school. And so we were streamed in a grammar school, and the grammar school was the preparation basically for university education. You needed a grammar school certificate in order to enter university. Right. And so I went through that grammar school and I went through university. And what is interesting, we had actually psychology and philosophy as a required subject in grammar school. There was at age, what we call grade 7, what you call here grade 11 and 12. So at age 17 and 18, or 16, 17, 18, you would enter philosophical psychological education. Everybody had to take it in grammar school. And there was a required course. So I think 1 year was philosophy, 1 year was psychology. And that is basically what I then did at university. So I found that fascinating. And
your interest was very early then. Your interest was from what we would call the time of high school.
Yeah.
And carried over into your university years.
Yes. Huh. I think that's fair to say that at age 16, 17, I was interested in philosophy and psychology. I actually studied both. I'm actually ABD in philosophy, but that's a different topic in order to understand it. Because Austria used to have a curriculum where you move directly to the PhD. You know, that was really the old system. You don't have anything, you have no bachelor or master, you go directly to the PhD. And in philosophy, I was in the old system. I could have directly, I was ABD in philosophy. I just needed my dissertation. But in psychology, they adopted the new curriculum where you have to go first to a master's degree and then to a PhD. And now I'm not exactly sure how it is nowadays, but there was no bachelor's degree at the time.
So what areas of psychology interested you then?
Well, I mean, this is an interesting, you could make the argument that my interest in critical psychology or critique of psychology goes back to those times. Because I found psychology not very interesting. You know, there was this gap between what you expect from psychology and what psychology actually did. And I think we also have to consider, as historians of psychology, what has been called the Americanization of German-speaking psychology. So you have a German-speaking psychology, you have an Austrian psychology that is, in my view, behind German psychology, and adopted theories, practices, ideas that were already outdated. So we had a social psychologist, as one example, who was basically a behaviorist. And he wanted to do a behavioristic social psychology. And it was so strange, I think, for us as students that we thought, you know, there is something wrong with psychology if psychology is what you're doing.
And this was in like the 1980s? Is this like in the early 1980s?
Yeah, 1983 or something like that, maybe. I started studying in 1981, but 1983 sort of we encountered maybe social psychology, which was completely removed from what we would consider our intuition about social psychology, socially and psychologically and politically relevant topics. And then there's a guy who does strange stuff in social psychology. I couldn't even recount what he did. It was so strange. Didn't leave an impression that I would, although I did an exam in social psychology. I don't even remember actually what.
So you were not conditioned properly. Yeah,
I was not conditioned properly. And also another anecdote that I have for you is I had a colleague, she wanted to do the experience of unemployment, and she had this idea of Jahoda, who did a famous studies in the 1930s, close to Vienna. And she wanted to do a similar study on how Austrians experience unemployment. And again, the professor said, no, this is not how you can do a thesis, master thesis, because you have to have hypotheses such as unemployment increases depression, and you have measures for unemployment, for depression, and then you do a statistical test to show whether unemployment, you have a control group, and then you show whether unemployment really increases depression or not. So the experience of unemployment was not a topic that you could actually study. And again, that was very strange for us. So to be honest, I would probably have abandoned psychology, even were for institutional reasons that I actually got grant money based on studying psychology. So the grant that I received was based on committing to psychology, and then so I continued with psychology. But I moved more to philosophy, which I found more interesting. In hindsight, of course, philosophy is a very difficult area as well to find positions. So maybe it was a good decision to remain in psychology. But what is more important, I think, is that it engendered an interest in the critique of psychology. And so in Vienna, we did already, as students, we formed a student group called Society for Critical Psychology. It still exists nowadays. There's still people there. It's recognized by the professional organization. Now you can take courses now. There was basically a counterculture, if you like, in psychology. And we invited people from Germany and critical psychologists, and they gave seminars and had alternative ideas how we could do psychology. They were mostly from Germany, indeed.
So this would be
how we could do psychology differently.
So this would be a really good time for you to outline for our listeners what critical psychology is and its relationship to older critical theory. What does that? What do those phrases mean?
So this is a very difficult topic, of course, and sometimes if I'm lazy, I give you an operational definition. Critical psychology is what critical psychologists do. But if you want more than a lazy definition, I think
you're not allowed to be a behaviorist about critical psychology.
Yeah. I think critical psychology, in a very broad definition, is an attempt to do justice to a variety of objects. And these objects can be other people and communities. You want to do justice to communities. In German critical psychology, we want to do justice to the subject matter of psychology. So the idea that psychology is actually not doing justice to the subject matter of psychology, and that's why it's a very theoretical approach. I was not particularly interested in specific communities. So lots of people understand critical psychology. We need to do justice to people with disabilities. We need to do justice to people in poor neighborhoods. We need to do justice to people who migrated to a country. We need to do justice to the unemployed. We need to do justice to the disenfranchised, the marginalized, oppressed, and so forth. That is sort of a specific understanding, I think, of critical psychology. This is what I'm saying. They try to do justice to communities. You can also try to do justice to history, culture, and society. And I would label those people also critical psychologists. They're more theoretical. They can be historical, or they can be critical historians. That is also trying to do justice to the past. And so, given that there's saying that, you mean it shows that you have various streams of critical psychology. So German critical psychology, in the tradition of Klaus Holzkamp, is probably a psychology that was much more interested in theory, the subject matter of psychology, in what he calls a foundation of psychology. He believed psychology doesn't have foundation and that he can provide that foundation for psychology. A very modern project, of course, and that is basically what he tried to do. So he was not particularly interested in specific groups, as let's say North American critical psychology or critical psychiatry, which is interested in patients, psychiatry patients, or other groups. They choose specific groups, racialized groups, minorities, and assume that they are not doing justice to those groups. So Holzkamp has a very strong theoretical interest. So critical psychology in that sense is then about a critique of the status quo, a critique of what exists, let's say in psychology, or the theories that exist in psychology, the methods in psychology, is an attempt to reconstruct how that came to this point. How did this happen that we have psychology looking this way? And that requires, of course, historical work. And I think the third point is providing alternatives, alternative ideas, alternative theories, but also alternative concepts. So we discussed one alternative concept such as epistemological violence. So I think that critical psychology needs to provide counter concepts that elucidate, so to say, what is going on in a certain area, and also counter theories, of course. So a theory of subjectivity is for me a counter theory as well, that tries to capture, so to say, what is going on and has a critical dimension, although I didn't emphasize the critical dimension to you, but there's certain elements that I would consider having a critical dimension. And German critical psychology drew partially on critical theory, but not necessarily. So German critical psychology in the appearance of what Klaus Holzkamp did was less influenced by critical theory. But there were lots of critical psychologists who were influenced by critical theory, actually. And so some of those people came to Vienna and gave talks about critical psychology that has a strong critical theory tradition, but also a strong psychoanalytic tradition. So as you know, in critical theory, psychoanalysis was a pretty important program.
People like Erich
lots
Fromm,
of them, yeah. Marcuse, lots of people who used psychology thought you need psychoanalysis. And German critical psychology, in the meaning of Holzkamp, they thought they can have an alternative theory to psychoanalysis. So they would not rely on psychoanalysis in order to make their points.
Right. So Adorno, Horkheimer, Marcuse, as you mentioned, these are not, I can use the word critical people to the Holzkamp version of critical psychology, but there's a family resemblance between the programs. Is that a way?
Yes, I think that's there's a family resemblance. Yeah, I'm trying to make sense exactly of the whole project of critical psychology, and so I put them together under an umbrella by saying they wanted to actually do justice to either subject matter to certain communities or to history, culture, and society, which is very often not done in traditional psychology.
Right. So you did a master's and a doctorate at the University of Vienna. You're already interested in critical psychology by that time, but then you did a postdoc in Berlin at the Max Planck for Human Development. Is that right?
I already moved to Berlin because during my PhD times, because we didn't have tuition in neither Austrian or German. So I was enrolled at the University of Vienna and I was enrolled at the Free University of Berlin at the same time. Yes. Don't pay tuition, you're enrolled at two universities, not a big deal. But I finished my PhD in Austria because I studied there. And I was not necessarily a real student of German critical psychology. Some of my work was more critical also of German critical psychology. So I wanted to have a distance also to the German critical psychology. So I moved to Berlin, finished my PhD in Berlin, but defended it in Austria, and then got a job looking for jobs. And you might not know that, but I was originally a statistician. I did actually empirical quantitative work. I was pretty good, I guess, I would say, in doing statistical analysis. And I mean, that was the first job, was as a research assistant first. And I did statistical analysis for lots of people, day in, day out. And then I graduated, and then I was hired as a postdoc And after that, actually, as a researcher, as a junior researcher, after the postdoc as a junior researcher, and then I moved to Canada, to York University.
That's an interesting example of subjectivity. Like, how did being interested in critical psychology, being critical of psychology, but then being hired as a statistician to assist on more conventional research, how did that affect your subjectivity, I guess, as a psychologist or as an academic? Or did it?
Yes, I think it was a Marxist whose name I forget in Berlin, who said as a Marxist, you have to always work twice as hard because you have to know the whole traditional theory, the traditional working, and you have to know the alternatives. Yeah. And so you have to be completely familiar with the alternative, but also with the tradition. And so I think maybe I took this seriously, this idea that if you want to be a critical psychologist, you actually have to understand the actual practice of mainstream psychology. And it was in many ways traditional mainstream psychology. Although the theories were not mainstream anymore, the practice of research was very traditional, very mainstream, and required a lot of statistic analysis. And so I took this seriously, that in order to criticize and challenge the mainstream, you actually have to know what is going on in the mainstream, and you embody and experience the strengths, but also the limitations and the weaknesses of traditional research. And so, in that sense, it was beneficial to me. But of course, it was also about making money. It was impossible to make money as as a critical psychologist or even as a theoretical psychologist at the time.
Right.
And so I did traditional research originally. I have actually empirical publications. I have even a publication, it's more a technical research report on structural equation modeling. We did, lots of empirical studies, and some of them are actually published.
Yeah.
What was interesting about the Max Planck Institute is that the Max Planck Institute gives you real time to do research. And if you do longitudinal research, the advantage of longitudinal research is that you really can trace, sort of say, a phenomenon over a period of time with the same participants and what's happening, sort of say, in terms of inter-individual and intra-individual mental life. The problem was that my director started the project in the 1970s. And in the 1970s, Piaget and Kohlberg was really big. And in the 1980s and 90s, Piaget and Kohlberg was not big anymore. So you have this fascinating longitudinal study that really used Piagetian and Kohlbergian instruments over a long period of time with lots of data, lots of, if you like, knowledge production. But in the 90s, nobody was interested in Piaget and Kohlberg anymore. And so this is an interesting, fascinating topic in terms of the sociology of science as well. Yes, you have institutes that allow you really to do longitudinal research work without pressure, without constantly publishing. And then when you're ready to publish, people are not actually interested anymore because Piaget and Kohlberg has fallen out of interest.
Right. So the theory.
And so this is part of, so there's also a reason why. So there's a variety of reasons, but I myself, I published on Kohlberg. I did actually my master's thesis on Kohlberg. Lost also interest in Kohlberg and Piaget for a variety of reasons. Some of them are intellectual, some of them are, of course, social and cultural. But I think it's a fascinating topic to do a history of science.
Yeah. It's interesting how the theories themselves turn over so fast that it becomes almost impossible to do serious longitudinal research. So after you had been at the Max Planck for a while, you got this job in Canada, the job at York University. That must have been quite a shift in your professional trajectory. How did that come to be?
Well, we had as you know, a history theory program, and I'm pretty sure I did theoretical work. I didn't do much historical work, but I was interested in doing historical work. And so, I published articles on the history of German psychology, history of critical psychology, some histories of race and racism. But this is interesting historically itself, how actually the history is less rewarding or less rewarded than certain stuff that has theoretical attention or theoretical impact. So I did an article on the history of German psychology in the 19th century as one example. Textbooks in the middle of the 19th century, which is, I think, quite interesting, but basically nobody was interested in that. And you have 10 people maybe reading that stuff, or 5 people, and maybe the same amount of people citing that type of work. And that leads us back to the neoliberalization of academia and the impact on subjectivity. So it's not very rewarding if you spend a lot of time on stuff that nobody's interested in.
I, for one, was interested in that because you showed that there was a discipline of psychology decades and decades before Wundt in German academia. But it's kind of ironic that your critique of neoliberalism comes from an actual acceptance of the needs of living in a neoliberal society.
No, I'm not saying it's only the reward structure or the impact. There's maybe also, Bacon's Idols of the Cave, maybe a certain, and so I moved basically more into theoretical stuff personally. And so there's a larger reward structure in theoretical stuff, at least for me.
So what did you find, what struck you as different about North American psychology when you arrived here compared to the European psychology you've been trained on?
Well, one example is, and I think I articulated that actually in one of my articles, when I talk about indigenous reconstruction of German critical psychology, that the way we learned history was very different from the way history of psychology was taught here. The way the history of psychology was discussed in Germany or Austria was very different from the way it was discussed here. And here you have really this sort of this strong Wundtian tradition that, it is Wundt and 1879. And in my experience, it was much more amorphous. And it was not clear, so to say, that Wundt was an important figure, but one figure among many other figures, actually. And even if people don't believe that Wundt was the only important person in North America, there was still one had to relate to Boring, one had to relate to other people's arguments. And in relating to those arguments, you to a certain degree repeat the same arguments. And the history looked for me very, very different. The way it was written here than it was written in Germany or Austria. And that led me then to consider, to think about sort of what is actually indigenous about German critical psychology. The idea that culture or indigenousness, cultural aspects always inform history. We always have a motivated historiography, if you like. Let's call it motivated historiography. Mm-hmm. That it comes from a certain perspective, it has certain traditions and resources, and we relate to those traditions and horizons. And so coming away from Germany, I realized that how unimportant, how unknown German critical psychology actually was. There was also sort of an interesting phenomenon. So, and also the concepts that were used, the ideas that were used, there was no reception basically for that type of thinking in North America. And so that led me to reconstruct, but what are certain indigenous elements in German critical psychology? And Holzkamp comes out of this tradition that is really relying on German resources, maybe has also a certain antipathy against American psychology, the idea that American psychology has these strong behavioristic leanings, talking about the 70s, 80s, and a lot of critiques sort of against behaviorism, and maybe also didn't capture the whole complexity of American psychology or North American psychology. And that stimulated indeed, so that experience stimulated indeed writing sort of a history of German critical psychology from an indigenous perspective. Right. I think that would be one thing, how this translated.
So do you think the emphasis on Wundt in sort of the North American historiography of psychology comes from the fact that Wundt opened himself to many foreign doctoral students, American doctoral students, more so than many of the other important people who were working in psychology in Germany at the time, people like Stumpf and Müller, G.E. Müller. And because he opened himself to those Americans, there were many American psychologists, early American psychologists, who came from Wundt, and that made Wundt loom much larger on the American horizon than he did in his own homeland.
Yeah, I think I'm sure this is an important element in how Wundt was received in North America, because as we know, many Americans studied under Wundt, many influential Americans studied under Wundt. And so that is, I'm sure, one element. But that's interesting, because that was probably less of relevance to German historiography. The German historiographers, it was not interesting how many Americans went back to America with Wundt's psychology.
Well, as I recall, even was kind of dismissive of Wundt because he had so many students and was generating this huge number of doctorates, much more so than Stumpf himself did, or than G.E. Mueller or anybody else.
Yeah,
but it seemed to work in the long run.
Yes, when I talk to my students about is psychology a continuous or discontinuous discipline, which is very difficult for them to understand, I ask them, which studies from Wundt do you know? Is there any content that you know from Wundt? What did Wundt do? What did Wundt contribute to knowledge in psychology? And nobody knows anything. And maybe they know that there was a lab and a journal maybe that he established, and there was maybe a textbook, and he had an interesting lab. That is it. And all the other details are completely lost on them. Content is completely lost on them. And so I ask them, so is then what brick did Wundt contribute to the building of psychology in terms of content?
Right.
There's no answer anymore.
No, that's exactly my experience as well. That if they know of him at all, they know the journal, and they know the lab, and they might know a couple of his students who became famous early American psychologists, but they don't know anything about Wundt's work at all, except they say introspection. They seem to know the word introspection.
Yeah. And they don't know what introspection actually is. Introspection, yeah. Okay, no, so we're not going to complain about students, but
the whole complexity there about various words being translated into English as introspection, even though they mean opposite things or different things in German itself. So. All right. Thank you very much. I think that's a good place to wrap it up. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
All right. All right. So that's all for our 5th episode of the History of Psychology show. I'd like to thank Thomas Teo again for spending some time with us. I have an announcement about the show. I have been doing it every week for 5 weeks now, and I think I'm going to go to every second week from now on. It's been great to do this. I've really enjoyed it, but it is taking up pretty much every waking hour, and I have some other things I need to do as well. So there won't be a show next Saturday, but there will be a new one, a 6th episode, 2 weeks from today. I hope you enjoyed it. As always, you can find us at YouTube, the History of Psychology show. We love to read your comments if you have them, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.